This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Okay, everybody, thanks very much for coming back, and I hope you had a good lunch break. We have a fantastic panel coming up now, entitled International Mechanisms to Protect Communities and Human Rights Defenders Working on Environmental Degradation and Land Rights. As you'll have seen, we're running a little bit behind schedule, so the programme that you have indicates that the end of the day will be at 5:45, and so this is just a warning that we will probably be running a little bit later, and we'll probably finish somewhere slightly closer to 6 o'clock. Now, without further ado, I'll hand over to the panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Sanjay. I'm Ingrid Gubbay. I'm from a film solicitors called Hausfeld & Co. A couple of decades been running these actions under the ATS, so we're looking very interestingly at what's going on here in England and other jurisdictions. I have before me a very youthful by nature, but veterans of this field, so they are very eminent and probably known well to you. Peter Frankental of Amnesty International, and Peter is the Economic Relations Programme Director at Amnesty and Chair of CORE, the CORE Coalition. And the CORE Coalition is working very hard and lobbying very hard, I know, in relation to the civil cost changes that Shanti was talking to you about earlier and their impacts on victims of human rights abuse abroad. And that will be followed with Tricia Feeney. And Tricia is from RAID. She's the Executive Director. And I think she's just come back from conflict zone Congo. Looking very refreshed. Obviously loves confrontation. That will be followed with a presentation by Sheldon. Sheldon, you may all know, is from the Essex Human Rights Law School, and Sheldon is director there of the Business and Human Rights Project, and he's also a member of the advisory to the Human Rights Committee of the Law Society of England and Wales. He teaches there, and I think he's very involved also in some of the cases that are currently going on. And that followed by Andie Lambe from Global Witness, who's had a long history in this area. And very involved in the Ending Impunity campaign, working to break the links between natural resources, corruption and conflict, and I think is the founding director of Reprieve. And the topic for this panel is international mechanisms that guarantee protection for communities and activists whose rights may be adversely affected by the operations of multinational companies. But then, having looked at the various panel contributions, it may not be directly obvious that that's what this is about. But having spoken to Rob, I think it's very relevant to be looking at accountability to increase safety for PBI members as well, and how that works. So these I won't say any more. These contributions will be very much on point, and we expect some pretty tough questions at the end. Peter.
Thank you, Ingrid, and good afternoon, everyone. I've been asked to open by talking about some of the challenges for the UK government in implementing the UN framework and guiding principles. Now, many of you have lived with the UN Special Representative's mandate for the last 6 years, but for the benefit of those few people who might not be familiar with the UN framework and guiding principles, I'll just give a very brief summary. The UN Special Representative on Business and Human Rights, John Ruggie, spent 6 years working to his mandate, a mandate of the Human Rights Council, and in June this year, a report of his a UN framework with 31 guiding principles, was endorsed by the UN Human Rights Council, and a working group, a UN working group, was established to take this work forward, essentially to clarify some of the issues raised in this framework, to liaise with relevant stakeholders, business, governments, NGOs, human rights defenders, to review progress and report back to the Human Rights Council. So there is a certain momentum. And this framework is the first ever UN-endorsed framework on business and human rights, so it's highly significant. There are many strengths and weaknesses to this framework, depending on where one is coming from, but certainly at a normative level, it reflects a strong advance on what went before. It's been widely recognised, it has a lot of legitimacy, and we must all hope that the momentum that's been generated will continue. Now, the UK government has been a very strong supporter of the mandate of the UN Special Representative, perhaps one of the staunchest supporters of the mandate. The UK voted in favour of the resolution that endorsed the framework and set up the working group. And the challenge now is to move from endorsing the framework in principle to actually embedding it in practice across UK government policy. And that's a very big challenge. Perhaps the best document that actually sets out the scale of this challenge was a report by the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Human Rights in December 2009. The report is called Any of Our Business, Human Rights in the UK Private Sector, and it analyses some of the issues and failings of the UK government in addressing business impacts on human rights. It recommends that the government have an overarching strategy on business and human rights, which has been lacking until now, and that this strategy should present a clear and coherent connecting thread between domestic policy, foreign policy, and the UK's international diplomacy, including at the EU, OECD, and UN level. Now, to its credit, the UK has for the first time established a cross-departmental working group on business and human rights to achieve the coherence and consistency of policy that until now has been lacking. Whether this working group, led by the Foreign Office, will have the status and authority to exert significant influence over government policy across departments remains to be seen. But there are multiple challenges facing the government if it is to embed the UN framework and guiding principles across policy. For example, how can raising human rights standards for business be made compatible with the government's growth and prosperity agenda? Reducing red tape and relaxing regulations for business has become a mantra for the government. Every government department is required to publish a summary of regulatory changes they intend to introduce to reduce the burden on UK business. The Department of Business Innovation and Skills, BIS, is leading the charge on this. It's also leading on a consultation for a new reporting framework for business, including reporting on social and environmental impacts. NGOs in the UK, including the Corporate Responsibility Coalition, will be trying to influence this framework to ensure that social and environmental reporting by companies becomes more balanced, relevant and reliable. A study conducted by the Core Coalition a couple of years ago found that very few FTSE 100 companies report at all on their human rights impact. So there's a long way to go before we have an effective UK regime for social and environmental reporting by companies that address human rights impacts. So the question is, will the new reporting framework that the government intends to introduce, will it become hostage to the government's commitment to reduce regulatory burdens? Perhaps a more fundamental question is whether the UN framework and guiding principles themselves will become hostage to the inexorable pressures on states to attract inward investment and facilitate investment by their own companies abroad. For many states, particularly in the south, their competitive advantage lies to a considerable extent in their low standards, the lack of enforcement of existing laws, and the ease by which companies can bypass regulations, including sometimes through bribery and corruption. And these pressures are compounded by the powerful backers that many of these companies have: sovereign wealth funds, private equity funds, multilateral development banks, commercial banks. The push for land and natural resources in the south is often putting human rights defenders at loggerheads, not just with the companies that operate the projects, but also with their equity holders and the financial institutions that support them. The engine for international trade and development is not just driven by multinational corporations, or, as some would believe, by China's expanding economy and quest for resources. But, for example, the UK this year has sent high-profile delegations to China and to the Middle East in the wake of the Arab Spring. The UK was one of the first countries to declare Libya open for business again a few weeks ago. So this is the context in which the human rights community has to try to give traction to the UN framework and guiding principles. And it's also the context in which individual governments have to address conflicting pressures, promoting trade and investment on the one hand, and promoting and protecting human rights on the other. The Foreign Secretary, to his credit, has recognised that these two approaches need to be pursued in tandem. But this is easier said than done. There is one inescapable reality behind the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, a reality for governments and for companies. They require companies to do much more than most companies are currently doing. And in this respect, the due diligence requirements that John Ruggie has conceptualised are very onerous. Guiding Principle 13, for instance, calls on companies to avoid causing or contributing to adverse human rights impacts, either through their own activities or through any of their business relationships, and to address such impacts when they occur. The steps that companies and governments would have to take to achieve this, as outlined in the guiding principles, present an enormous challenge. Let's just take, for example, one particular step: human rights impact assessments, referred to this morning. Jorge said that very few companies in Colombia undertake these impact assessments pre-exploration. Wilfredo said that in the Oaxaca context, there were no human rights impact assessments. These are a requirement set out in Guiding Principles 17, 18 and 19. If these assessments were to be conducted properly at the feasibility stage of a project, with adequate consultation of affected communities, with the free, prior and informed consent of indigenous peoples, if they're to encompass, as they should, the whole spectrum of human rights that might be affected by a project, then this would have enormous consequences for the companies undertaking the project and for their financial backers. Fundamental decisions about the location of a project, its design, would be affected, and they would be very different than if no proper impact assessments were conducted. Some projects wouldn't take place at all. Others would only proceed after considerable delays. And every day's delay represents lost revenue to the company and its backers. If human rights impact assessments are to be a part of regulatory requirements, as they should be, then this certainly would place a considerable burden on companies. So in this respect, human rights does come at a price for companies and their investors. But when human rights impacts are ignored in project planning and implementation, as they so often are, then the price is borne by affected communities. Finally, I'd like to draw attention to 5 steps that I believe would be perfectly feasible and realistic for the UK to take to implement the UN framework and the guiding principles. The first is that country desk officers at the Foreign Office and missions abroad should have a good understanding of the human rights context of UK companies operating in these countries. As was said this morning, missions abroad are often very willing to raise the case of human rights defenders, but are they willing to challenge companies and hold them to account for allegations of human rights abuses? So that's one important step that would have to be supported by training and awareness raising so that UK missions can intervene in contexts where UK companies are alleged to be contributing to violations. A second step is for trade promotion delegations to be aware of and find ways of raising human rights issues with host countries, as they often do, but especially when the issues are relevant to the trade and investment activities and impacts of UK companies operating there. A third step would be to have a much more joined-up thinking across government departments, FCO, BIS, DFID, Ministry of Justice and other departments. For example, let's take UK Trade and Investment, UKTI. It's an arm of the government, it's an agency of the government that promotes UK trade and investment overseas and provides services to UK companies investing overseas. Colombia is described on UKTI's website as enjoying a long tradition of economic and political stability. Human rights are not referred to at all amongst the challenges the businesses operating in Colombia, despite the many UK companies that have had their reputations tarnished because of associations with human rights violations in Colombia. So I don't believe, for example, that the Foreign Office would take a similar view, but there does need to be joined-up thinking across UK departments and agencies. A fourth issue is that the UK government should consider and implement a wide range of measures to hold UK companies accountable for human rights abuses abroad. One of the measures that's being promoted by the UK Corporate Responsibility Coalition is the creation of a new body to address the human rights and environmental impacts of UK companies when operating abroad. This body would be a UK Commission on Business, Human Rights and Environment, and it would have three functions. The first would be an ombudsman function to receive, investigate and settle complaints against UK parent companies relating to human rights abuses committed by their subsidiaries in other countries. The second function would be a promotional function to clarify and communicate appropriate standards to UK companies. And the third function would be a capacity building role in helping to strengthen local mechanisms in the countries hosting the investment so that companies can be held more effectively to account in the host country and so better remedies are available. For example, by working with national human rights institutions in the host country. And the final step, and this has been well covered this morning, is that the government should improve access to judicial remedies, to judicial remedies in the UK. And a good starting point would be to support the amendments that Shanta referred to this morning to the Legal Aid Sentencing and Punishment of Offenders Bill, which at the moment, if the current provisions are passed, would make it very, very difficult for the kind of cases that have been taken in the past to continue to be taken. So these are the steps that I believe the UK government can take, which are feasible. They will not put the UK economy at a competitive advantage, and they would make advocating against environmental degradation and human rights violations a much less dangerous business for human rights defenders.
Thanks. My name is Tricia Feeney. I run an NGO called Rights and Accountability and Development. Can you hear me? And we've been working over a number of years, particularly in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and engaging in some of the efforts of NGOs and others to sort of create some international mechanism for bringing complaints before the UN human rights bodies, although there's no dedicated procedure, and we're disappointed with the outcome of the work of the Special Representative in that area. But that doesn't mean to say that we can't do other things. Obviously, I want to talk about the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises, which has been discussed a bit this morning, while acknowledging it has its limitations. I think what's nevertheless, it does offer one sort of venue, and although it is certainly not a remedy in the kind of human rights sense, it's not an effective remedy, or indeed any kind of remedy given the very limited remit of national contact points. I think it's something that is worth considering as part of an overall strategy in bringing a case to global attention. The guidelines, for those of you who don't know, are a set of recommendations which have been developed by now 42 governments, 30 of them the most industrialized, richest governments in the world. It was established in the OECD in Paris, really as a kind of way of diverting work within the UN to develop aid on transnational enterprises, which was scuppered over many years. So they've always been, in a way, an opposition to some UN system. They contain recommendations on human rights, supply chain management, labour relations, environment, combating bribery, consumer interests, competition, and taxation. And the thing that has made them of interest since the guidelines were revised in 2000 was the establishment of a complaints mechanism called a specific instance facilities, by which national contact points, who are basically government officials, there may be a unit, they're very often set up in the investment bit of the Ministry of Economic Relations in the UK. They're located in the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills and BIS. So it's a limited remit. They are able to offer offices to resolve disputes between companies and communities and workers that may arise from alleged non-observance of guidelines. The guidelines are part of the OECD Declaration on International Investment in Multinational Enterprises. So really, they were tacked onto that document, which is very much about opening up other people's economies to our investors. We've had 10 years' experience of working with the guidelines, and in that time, NGOs have filed about 100 cases. Very many of them to do with extractive industries, but not exclusively. And the unions have filed about 130 cases. As regards the NGO complaints, the most common type of claim concerns what the chapters are divided up. There's a general policies chapter. So nearly all of the complaints have fallen within this general policies chapter. And certainly half of those have dealt directly with alleged violations of human rights by companies. There have also been allegations of companies seeking exemptions from regulations or existing law, tax breaks, etc. Failure to contribute to sustainable development, and improper or inadequate engagement with local communities. So very much what we've been hearing about earlier today. A large number of NGO cases dealt with supply chain issues, particularly if you're thinking of countries like the Congo, where you have the conflict minerals, and so it wasn't the end users, the electronics companies who were directly involved in the abuses in the Kivus, but they're intermediaries, people further down the supply chain. And these cases were being rejected wholesale by most national contact points on the grounds that they were these were not investment-type relations. And so it was a real kind of some artificial block on bringing some of the most egregious cases to this mechanism. The guidelines were revised, and in May of this year, the new text was adopted. There are now 11 chapters instead of 10, and that's because, following the work of John Ruggie, a new dedicated human rights chapter has been adopted that is broadly in alignment with John Ruggie's guiding principles. And the key thing being that companies should respect international human rights wherever they operate, even in countries where they're not respected by the governments themselves. And that they have to carry out due diligence to ensure that they comply with human rights. The employment chapter is now aligned with the ILO tripartite declaration, and so it now talks about workers and not employees. I'm getting nervous. Which is a big advance, because obviously a lot of people are not employees, they're contract labour or day casual workers, and they were excluded. The environment chapter was not particularly enhanced, but they did manage to smuggle in something about avoiding greenhouse gas emissions. But obviously the biggest improvement is the issues to do with risk-based due diligence, not only on human rights, which obviously is central to our concerns, but throughout many other aspects of companies' operations. Shortcomings and gaps are many. I think in the procedures, one thing that has worried us is after a lot of campaigning in the UK, and one of the first cases we brought was actually concerned Anglo-American when it was in Zambia, which ran into the sands, not Zambia, but the complaint, was to realise that we had to have timelines, that you had to know where you were. It wasn't just a black box when you sent a complaint and nobody answered your phone call in government, which was how it was operating initially. But the other thing was that there's no point just talking about mediation. Not all cases are appropriate for mediation. If there's been a gross human rights problem and if for some reason you can't get access to justice, to a judicial mechanism, then you should at least get a determination based on the evidence that you're able to present and the other party can contest. And on this issue, we pressed very hard during the review to say that, have the 3 stages of the initial assessment, whether a case merits being accepted, have the mediation attempt, but then, if mediation isn't possible, go to determination. And, it's important, if we're serious about setting standards and having benchmarks, then companies have to know, are they on track, are they in compliance, or are they not? And it also makes it very hard for companies that are trying to be good if everybody's just the same. That has been extremely, we were unable to get that accepted, although the UK continues to be the one exception, positive in this case, that they do reach a determination. Major shortcomings include, although Indigenous peoples are referred to, it's not as clear as we would like. There's no reference to the UN Declaration, and there's no reference to free, prior and informed consent. The bribery chapter was slightly improved, but not sufficiently. I will not read all of this, but I would say that there's a lot of... The OECD guidelines are obviously not the answer. I think that they have become kind of paradigm of how a sort of procedure, a future procedure with more effectiveness could operate. It is possible, even if these are cases happening in remote corners of the world. It's not beyond the powers of intelligent people to deal with them in a fair and impartial way. So they're part of the, they're on the road to finding a solution. Over the next year, let's talk about developing sector-specific guidelines. So obviously something on mining extractives would be very timely. Making clear the role and obligations of the financial sector, and that's been accepted that they should fall within the remit. But how exactly that will happen has not been elaborated. And exactly what is meant by community engagement, which is much weaker than what we had hoped for. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thanks, Ingrid. I want to start off by registering my shock as Ingrid introduced us as veterans of this whole enterprise, when I feel kind of totally green behind the ears. There are total surprises that come to me very often in the area. I'm learning a lot, and one of them has to do with the theme of today that I've been asked to talk about, which is the areas of corporate law that can serve as a link to the chain of international protection of victims. I'm going to focus in the 10 minutes I've got on corporate law per se, and within that on a particular area of corporate law, the relationship between parent companies and subsidiaries. Parents usually located in one of the jurisdictions in the richer parts of the world, primarily EU, US, North America, etc. And subsidiaries are very often in weaker, poorer parts of the world. Now, what I want to kind of focus here on, though, is just exactly why should we be interested in holding parent companies liable? The answer, I think, is pretty obvious, but is worth keeping in mind. If we don't, we have a clear split between the locus of real control and influence and the locus of responsibility. And that split is indeed something on which a lot of corporate law is grounded, but that's something we'll see as we move along. And to a limited degree, I think it's the task of human rights lawyers to try and narrow that gap as far as they can. And one of the obstacles here we've already heard about is known as the corporate veil. It's worth just quickly saying what that's about. It's basically one of the oldest ideas in corporate law, which is that a corporation is a body separate from its shareholders. And if the shareholders are a parent company which own the subsidiary, it's also a separate body. Now, why do you do that in corporate law? Well, the reason you do it is that you want to induce shareholders to invest in the company, and the tool often used for that is limited liability. The shareholder will not be liable for all of the debts and damages of the company. They'll only lose what they put in to buy their shares. And as I say, it's a very old doctrine. And transformed into the larger groupings of parent company and subsidiary, the same principle applies. The parent company is immune from responsibility under certain conditions. That is held by the subsidiary, assuming the source of the problem, say damage done to the environment, was from the subsidiary. So we have in the corporate veil a very deeply entrenched doctrine in corporate law, nonetheless an obstacle very often to human rights lawyers. But I'm going to, in the brief time I've got, try and sketch an alternative to piercing the veil. Piercing the veil is something available to a corporate lawyer broadly at the moment under two circumstances. Number one, if the subsidiary has been used to defraud by getting the parent company off the hook, the courts will ignore the subsidiary and go for the parent. Or if the parent is in such day-to-day control of the subsidiary that in really, for all intents and purposes, it's being run from London, the courts once again will pierce the veil. But those are relatively rare situations for us in the human rights field. Usually you're dealing with far more sophisticated companies than that, ones where in fact there is a degree of autonomy, a degree of policy making at the level of the subsidiary. So if we still think that it's important to hold parents liable, what's an alternative? Well, I want to bring before you what I think is a very important new area, really slowly developing, called the duty of care. The sort of thing that John Ruckey had in mind when he talked about the need for due diligence. And basically, I want to try and show you what it means via the example of Shell in Nigeria. As you may know, Shell is presently defending a case brought by the Friends of the Earth, as well as some villagers, in the Dutch courts. And the attack is on Shell parent, as well as the subsidiary. The Shell is relying in that case on the corporate veil. And it's doing this as a way of trying to have the best of both worlds. On the one hand, it's saying, we are excellent corporate citizens. Look at our website, look at our documentation, you will see we are full of guidelines for subsidiaries about how you should protect the environment. But they say, if the subsidiary goes wrong, we are in a standard parent-subsidiary relationship. That is to say, falling back on classic corporate law, we're not responsible. The subsidiary has enough autonomy day to day for the law to recognize its responsibility, but to go no further. Hard to resist this on classic grounds of overriding prevail for the two reasons I've given. There is probably in the subsidiary a degree of resistance to day-to-day control. They're pretty much in charge. And secondly, there's no question of fraud. So where do you go? Well, what we find is that actually there is a line of law developing around the notion of the duty of care, which is in fact taking a different line of attack on all of this. And it comes out in some recent UK litigation, but there is in fact parallel development elsewhere. The basic idea that is being now tried in the courts is saying, if a body such as Shell is providing guiding principles for its subsidiary, the issue isn't so much, is Shell in control of the subsidiary? Yes, of course, that's relevant, very relevant. But the real issue is the Shell putting itself, in the Shell parent, in a position such that the subsidiary is relying on it, that is turning to it for advice and guidance. And if so, then the parent is much like the position of a professional advising on what's necessary for your building to stand up, on what's necessary for you to do if you're a lawyer advising a client. In other words, then the role of the parent is as a standard setter does engage its responsibilities, its duty of care for what is done with that advice. It follows from that there is an ongoing, this is again citing UK jurisprudence, there's an ongoing obligation to follow along and see what the subsidiary has done with your advice. Has it or has it not misused it? And if you are aware that there's a risk that it will be misused, then you are responsible for trying to do something to stop it. Well, we've got the beginnings, it's nascent, of a germ of a very different line of attack on parents. And it's of vital importance now. Why? Because, as you well know, most of the leading companies do come out very forcefully to say, we have policies. We have policies in London and Amsterdam, in the center, that our subsidiaries are expected to follow. Fine. If so, you've got a duty of care. It'll be interesting to watch how it develops. Thanks.
Can I trade seats for you? I need to use that laptop.
Andie.
I don't understand. I'm not sure I can multitask that much. Oh, I see the little thing there. Yeah, that's fine. Okay, so the sort of question that we're posing is it's more of a sort of consultation. We've had a number of experiences trying to hold corporations to account and come up with a number of different sort of challenges and issues. So we've worked on a paper which comes up with some suggestions, and we are considering a consultation document, and it's available on our website, so please feel free to download it, read it, and give us your feedback, because it's an idea we're chucking out there, and we want to know what people think. Basically, it looks at how you can hold corporations accountable for their operations in conflict zones. zones for gross human rights abuses. So basically, businesses operating across borders can be implicated in serious human rights abuses, particularly those working in conflict areas. They may become caught up in conflict or seek to operate within areas of conflict so as to profit from the situation. While many businesses avoid conflict areas, the fact remains that many do not. The increasing drive to secure strategic natural resources is drawing business into places that until recently may have seemed too risky. Host states may be unable or unwilling to protect their citizens, and therefore there is a greater obligation on home states to ensure that their businesses are not enabling, condoning or facilitating human rights abuses. Unfortunately, Global Witness's investigations reveal the extent to which local and international business can become implicated in such crimes and abuses, either directly through their own operations or indirectly via their business relationships. Therefore, home states need to monitor, advise and, where appropriate, sanction businesses operating in these areas. Substantial legal opinion in many countries view existing criminal law, penal code provisions or other legislation as being applicable to business involvement in serious violations. However, attempts by Global Witness and others to encourage legal actions have exposed legal and practical challenges to their enforcement. Unfortunately, despite courts around the world being challenged to hold to account businesses involved in gross human rights abuses, and in particular those involved in violent or predatory crimes in conflict areas, no company has ever been successfully prosecuted, and only a handful of business people, for example Gus Cohenhoven in the Netherlands, have ever been convicted. There is no component of national or international law that is specifically designed to address the problem of businesses linked to serious violations of human rights, including their involvement in abuses that amount to crimes such as torture, sexual assault or murder. While laws against aiding and abetting, conspiracy or other modes of liabilities criminalise assistance to perpetrators of such crimes, the laws of most, if not all, national jurisdictions around the world do not specifically prohibit the involvement of their own registered or domiciled businesses in such crimes committed in conflict areas abroad. For example, there is no specific law against a business providing weapons or dual-use components to despotic state leaders which are then used to kill, or allowing company assets such as factory facilities or transport to be used for arbitrary detention, or financing state or non-state armed groups who commit gross human rights violations. Such activities by businesses are obviously unethical, even potentially illegal, but are not explicitly prohibited by criminal or penal codes anywhere. This has resulted in legal professionals looking for the law that fits the criminal, predominantly resulting in civil redress, for example, the Alien Tort Claims Act in the US. Frustratingly, Global Witness has encountered hesitation from prosecutors when it comes to investigating businesses for alleged involvement in human rights crimes committed abroad. At present, the greatest obstacle is that the existing legal framework in most countries does not address the specific legal challenges posed by the behaviour of business entities in conflict zones or other situations of widespread violence, which I'll come on to in the next slide. And of course, there are practical obstacles to investigation. For example, the necessity of law enforcement cooperation, multiple languages, logistical obstacles, and of course the risk to victims and the home state's ability to provide any form of protection. Sadly, however, there is also a lack of will on the part of some prosecutors to even consider, let alone attempt such cases. Some of this is due to the prosecutors themselves, but there is also a lack of political will at state level. Also, in my opinion, the weakest but most often voiced argument, a lack of resources. Whilst I'm not unaware of the resources issues faced by state prosecutors, there are a number of NGOs, some of the examples we've heard today, who have significantly less resources, who have been able to investigate and in some cases initiate prosecutions. And finally, and possibly most depressingly, there is often a lack of knowledge of international law applicable in their jurisdictions, and in some instances, a lack of knowledge of their own laws and their applicability to corporations. At present, the greatest obstacle is that the existing legal framework in most countries does not address the specific legal challenges posed by the behaviour of business entities in conflict zones or other situations of widespread violence. In brief, the problems in current legal frameworks include: to date, no jurisdiction has clarified what types of business activities are unacceptable in situations of conflict or widespread violence. States have differing rules about whether a business entity can be prosecuted under criminal law. Some permit prosecutions, others only for certain kinds of crimes, and some do not permit them at all. States have varying rules about how their laws can be applied to crimes committed abroad. Variations exist in the definition of complicity and accomplice liability used by national and international courts, particularly in the legal test for the mens rea or mental element of the crime. This has led Global Witness to propose a culpability framework for business entities involved in violent or predatory crimes in conflict zones, using existing domestic, anti-corruption and international criminal law as principal sources. We outline wrongful acts that we believe are covered by existing law and identify a standard for the mens rea or mental element of such crimes. These are referred to in detail in the following slide as Prohibition 1 and Prohibition 2 respectively. In addition, we propose a new prohibition, Prohibition 3, against the practice of dealing in conflict goods. Prohibition 3 is based on the existing illegalities against violent crimes and trafficking, including an affirmative defence for companies based on due diligence, and draws on norms which have evolved recently at the United Nations and the OECD against dealing in conflict minerals. Much of what we propose is not new law, but aims to clarify and expand existing law to make it more practicable and effective. It is, however, important to recognise that certain risks cannot be mitigated. In certain situations, the risk of culpability for a business operating in violent places or with violent actors may be so high that the only proper reaction would be to suspend or halt operations. The objective of the prohibitions is twofold. First, to facilitate legal action against rogue businesses operating in areas of widespread violence, and second, to encourage business entities to ensure that their behaviour remains above a common standard of unacceptable behaviour. All prohibitions would apply to domiciled and registered businesses and their associates abroad, i.e. employees, subsidiaries, agents or affiliates, applying the same theory of culpability common to most anti-corruption legislation. For Prohibition 3, affirmative defences may be available, in particular where the company has conducted due diligence, which includes fact-finding, risk assessment and taking steps to mitigate the risk of human rights abuses occurring. Prohibition 1 would specify in law the applicability to business entities of certain existing criminal penal law or equivalent provisions forbidding violent or predatory crimes. Targeted offences include murder, torture, rape, war crimes, crimes against humanity, forcing people to work or expulsion of people from communities in situations of armed conflict, the appropriation of natural resources without consent, linked to war or armed conflict, and the receipt of stolen goods and violation of UN sanctions. Prohibition 2 would specify in law the acts that constitute aiding and abetting by business entities in their relations to those who commit violent or predatory crimes. Substantial assistance would include knowingly providing transport, equipment, weapons, finance, and other logistical or material support in the commissions of crimes or crimes by others. Prohibition 3, for example, the US Dodd-Frank Act, Provision 1502, would introduce into law a prohibition against dealing in goods and services produced by means of the kinds of serious human rights abuses associated with situations of widespread violence, including conflict. To access the affirmative defence, business must prove that it has complied with national human rights law and international human rights standards, show they've exercised a duty of care. Proof for such defences may include filing with security commissions, justice departments, or showing a human rights impact assessment commensurate with best practice. A failure to show any of the above, or all of the above, could result in liability. There are already existing non-legal mechanisms for corporate accountability available to states, some of which have been utilised with a variety of success. The OECD Guidelines, as mentioned by Tricia earlier, UN sanctions, the enforcement and increased utilisation of these need to be improved. Businesses could be barred temporarily or permanently from doing business with government agencies and ruled ineligible for receiving export licences or other forms of government support, for example, insurance and other support from national credit agencies. Companies could be blacklisted. For example, the Norwegian State Pension Fund blacklists certain companies that refuse to engage or improve on human rights issues. Revoking a company's licence to operate or delisting a company from major stock exchanges. Although there is an emerging movement by states towards non-judicial remedies to deal with complaints, more work needs to be done in these areas to make them credible remedies. In addition, while steps forward, non-judicial remedies or business initiatives alone are not appropriate when crimes are committed. If criminal activity is alleged, judicial remedies are necessary to ensure accountability. So, very, very quickly, what states should do? They need to clarify the regulatory framework by clarifying how to prosecute businesses, amend existing legislation or pass new legislation to criminalise domiciled business entities for their involvement in abuse committed abroad, and compel domiciled businesses to carry out due diligence to ensure their trade is legal and complies with international human rights standards. They need to monitor and sanction bad behaviour. They need to sanction businesses that are found to be involved in these crimes, using techniques reflecting the severity of the violation, including criminal, civil or administrative penalties. Give immediate effect to UN sanctions and develop a fair and clear procedure for putting forward commercial entities and individuals for listing. Monitor the activities of businesses operating in conflict areas and require that they report on the implementation of their due diligence, and provide policy guidance, and of course provide sufficient resources. And in conclusion, there is a clear precedent for home states both investigating and prosecuting their own citizens as well as domiciled companies for crimes committed abroad. Surely, if governments can take legal action against their citizens implicated in international crime support or against their businesses entities involved in corruption in other countries, they should also exercise their legal power to prosecute business entities involved in violent or predatory crimes or serious human rights abuses. Conflict zones increase the risk of companies being involved or associated with human rights abuses. It should be emphasised that in many cases the presence of companies in these areas is not itself the problem, and that foreign investment can play an important role in promoting peace and stability, as well as efforts to promote democratic transition. However, it must be recognised that business can also contribute to entrenching human rights abuse and spread the violence in conflict areas. The behaviour of rogue businesses can have a significant impact on human rights in such places and pose a real risk to people, as well as the company's brand value and their home country's national economic or strategic interests. For all these reasons, strong protections need to be in place and countermeasures aggressively enforced. We hope the reforms suggested could close the loopholes that permit rogue businesses to operate with impunity, as well as clarify the basis on which business that mean well could continue to operate in difficult human rights contexts.
Thank you, Andie. There's always so much to say and very little time to say it all in. And thank you very much for these wonderful contributions. And I guess the themes here are, again, about enforcement, non-judicial and judicial. We're looking at the suggested commission that Peter's raised with the Ombudsman. We know that Ombudsmen typically look at things through the lens of what is fair and reasonable rather than looking at the background of the law. The law is outside of their remit generally, so questions about how effective a commission might be. The OECD Guidelines, which Tricia says are inadequate but on the way and moving things forward, and maybe another piece of the puzzle. And Sheldon's view about the duty of care and the emergent case law coming through on that will be very interesting to watch. And Andie, of course, lashing out and appropriately on the lack of regulation and political will around the world, particularly when you compare it to other sectors like the competition sector, moving forward, where you do have international shared cooperation, you do have compliance, you do have criminalisation, and you are looking at areas here where very recently implemented, there are inconsistencies of compliance, but overall working quite well. So we do have precedent across the world from the commercial sector, and increasingly companies are much more aware of their due diligence obligations in a whole range of things. This is not new. So it'll be interesting to see your questions coming forward, perhaps looking at these themes, which the panel is expert on, going forward. Now, because of recording, I'm told that I have to repeat your questions, and my memory is very short. So I'm going to have to ask you to try and keep it succinct when you are giving us the questions, and I shall try to repeat them comprehensively. Thanks. So who wants to ask first? Anyone? Because if you don't, then we want to hear more about the Commission. Rob. Sorry, do you want Rob?
Thank you, repeating.
Yes, thanks.
Hi, Rob from PBI. It's interesting that several of the panellists were speaking of the need for greater judicial mechanisms here in the UK to regulate the adverse impacts of companies operating abroad. And also what Peter began by saying of the tendency in government policy to deregulate and go in the other direction. I just wondered, looking at this potential conflict here, whether there's best practices apparent in other countries that we might be influenced by or could learn from.
Do we have any more questions before we start answering? Anyone? Yes.
Louise with Sally from AB Columbia. Sorry, I don't think I can get at it actually.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Did you say where you're from again?
Louise with Sally from AB Columbia. I was interested because we've had some discussion about the changes that are going to be made to the legal aid bill, and Peter mentioned these again, which are known as Jackson reforms. And Rugged actually pointed out as good practice what we already have, which will be abolished by this. So I'm wondering if the panel could comment on how committed they consider the UK government is to the actual implementation of the Rugged framework, because, you know, if they're already reversing it, it's one thing to say that they've been committed to it whilst it's being developed, but that's not enough, is it? We need beyond development to implementation. So.
And can we take one more just before we start answering the questions? Over here, Gabriella.
Maybe if I just raise my voice. So this was a question about. It's a question to Sheldon specifically about the duty of care on parent companies. And it is a little bit of a hypothetical question, but if we see this concept being developed, and especially in the context of the due diligence of parent companies, that's very much embodied in the guiding principles. I have, from the right to remedy perspective, I have a specific question, which is a scenario where a parent company is able to prove that it's actually applied a due diligence process. We've got a subsidiary company that cannot be held to account because it operates in a country where there's no effective access to justice. So we've got proof of an abuse, and non-accountable subsidiary, a parent company that's met its duty of care, and no remedy to the victims. So what would be the solution to that situation? Thank you.
Thanks, Gabriella. Can we start with you? The first question by Rob was looking at the international comparative view, and wherever you can fit that.
That's a question that we often get asked by the UK government. You know, what are our competitors doing? What are other countries doing? Aren't we way in the lead, particularly on civil litigation? The Business and Human Rights Resource Centre has a portal of all legal cases, civil litigation cases, and criminal cases against companies. And the portal on civil litigation cases, they're actually quite a limited number of cases. A handful of jurisdictions, I think about 4 or 5 in Europe, the Netherlands, France, Switzerland, Italy, there have been cases against parent companies. There's the US, there's Canada, possibly Australia, and I think 1 or 2 African cases. So actually there's very little jurisprudence in this area when it comes to civil litigation. When it comes to criminal activity, I think others such as Tricia and Andie will have a better idea. But one question is, shouldn't companies be subject to the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court and the Treaty of Rome? And I understand that until a very late stage of negotiations for the International Treaty of Rome, companies were considered to be a legitimate part of its remit. And it was only at a fairly late stage of negotiations that companies were removed. Just on the subject of the UK Commission on Business, Human Rights and Environment, there is a little booklet at the back setting the case for the Commission. But essentially it was based on an analysis by a human rights lawyer, Jennifer Zirk. She produced a publication for the Core Coalition called Filling the Gap, and looking at the gaps in civil litigation, in judicial mechanisms, and the idea of a non-judicial mechanism is quite simply there are many non-judicial mechanisms in the UK. Ombudsman-type functions, from the Financial Services Authority to the Banking Ombudsman to the Independent Police Complaints Commission. So there is actually custom and practice in this area. Whereas when it comes to civil litigation, there's only been a handful of cases over the past decade, and it looks as if the door's going to be closed even to that handful of cases through the Legal Aid Act.
Just to throw in a few ideas. I mean, on best practice, I think, sort of toughening up the reporting requirements, and I know that's something that the Core Coalition and others have been pressing for. And so you get much better information from the Canadian reports of the Canadian Exchange, even though the companies don't behave better, but at least to give it some ammunition. I think that could be enhanced, and something like the Frankental Act on the requirement to sort of give much more detailed information about the provenance of loans and how you've done your due diligence. And I think there's hope that the EU might take up something like that, when they've sorted out the global financial problem. I think the UK commitment to the guiding principles, Ruggie was supposed to be just stating what the law as it currently stands now is. It's odd to give that role to someone who's a political theorist rather than an international lawyer, but leave that to one side. Although he talked about the obstacles about access to justice, he didn't really put forward very sort of imperative sort of proposals about how those gaps and problems could be adopted and redressed. So I think that that's some work for all of us to do. I'll leave duty of care.
Thanks, Tricia.
Yes, to Gabriella's question. Could I just make one preliminary point? Forgive me. You might have noticed that the linchpin in this growing area of duty of care is that the parent company take the initiative to adopt these global due diligence policies about the environment, about human rights, etc. And then once it's taken that initiative, the duty of care kicks in. It becomes important that it follow through in the right way. The lesson to learn for that for some companies is, and I've actually discussed this with a company secretary once, best thing to do is sit on your hands if you're a parent. Don't do a thing. That way, nothing gets started. That way, your life stays simple. And that is a big gap in the current structure of responsibility in parent-subsidiary relationships. There are hints in the Ruggie report that he certainly gives you the tool for saying that's not good enough. What we need is something like we have vis-a-vis states when it comes to the duty to protect. And that is, you don't wait, human rights law doesn't wait around for the state to formulate a systematic approach to certain dangers and then to implement it. It tells you from the very beginning, you need a system that you're going to then allow more detailed implementation. What we need is the equivalent in corporate law if we're going to get closer to human rights. Okay. Now over to Gabrielle's question. She raises the interesting scenario of something that's different from the one I gave you. She's saying, well, what if the parent has done all it could have reasonably been expected to do, and nevertheless the subsidiary doesn't follow along with what it's meant to do? And the logic, of course, is the parent has done its duty, that the responsibility follows with the subsidiary per se. Unless you've got further policy arguments, which we can discuss, based on other legal doctrines about following resources into the parent, it stops with the subsidiary. What happens then to jurisdiction? I think that was one of your questions. Can we sue reasonably in the UK, for example, a company whose parent has well behaved, which would normally be sued, and all that's out there is the subsidiary? I would think you then fall back on the normal doctrines that would apply to non-EU companies, i.e. a company in Nigeria, let's say, whereby it may well be Nigerian law that applies, but there is a doctrine in the UK and elsewhere to an extent, it varies, which is that if you can show you will not get a fair trial in the place where the wrong happened, then you will have a basis for saying we should be able to try this in the UK, for example. But there are further hoops to get over about the connections that nevertheless need to be established. But that would be the direction I would have thought we'd have to go.
Yeah, just to sort of very briefly pick up on the need for greater judicial mechanisms. I mean, I think for me, and certainly from my experience of trying to bring criminal actions against individuals or corporations for gross human rights abuses, sometimes, up to sort of war crime type level, it is exceptionally difficult. And, it's even challenging at a civil redress level, and yet, to a certain extent, that is at least possible in practice as well as in theory. What we come across consistently is this sort of absolutely this issue of parent and subsidiary, and how basically access to justice just completely falls through the gap. You can't get access to justice where the crime took place because the subsidiary, the government is either implicit in the bad act or potentially unable to do anything about it due to lack of facilities and infrastructure. And the parent company cannot be held to account because they're not directly accountable for the actions of their subsidiary. So what happens if you're a person that's been harmed, or a family member has been harmed? Where do you go for any form of justice? And the answer at the moment is pretty much nowhere. And you have to spend years trying to find a jurisdiction or a prosecutor willing or able to stick their neck out on your behalf. And unfortunately, there aren't many of them out there. And I suppose that's why we came up with the suggestion. And I think, certainly this needs to come at a state level, and it happens in anti-corruption legislation, where you can be held responsible under the UK Bribery Act and also the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the States for the activities that take place within the US, but also for all the activities in terms of corruption and bribery for any of your employees, subsidiaries, agents, or affiliates anywhere in the world. So it is possible. It's just not being applied for human rights abuses. It's just at the moment being applied in the corruption sort of area. So it's there as a possibility. We just have to try and work on getting the political will and possibly the judicial cooperation to get it down in a legal precedent somewhere. And once you get it down somewhere, you can then utilise it in other jurisdictions.
Thanks, Andie. Just before we take more questions, just a little buzz note. You'll know the Queen's been in Perth, Australia, recently. And one of her many roles, she's actually been to a forum about a proposal to reform the Commonwealth designed to improve the way in which 54-nation body monitors human rights, and especially watered down, which is the subject of discussion. So the Commonwealth leaders have been holding these talks, and it hasn't been raised here, but I'm sure we've had it in the back of our minds, to create a new commissioner on the rule of law, democracy and human rights. And this was a proposal put forward by the Eminent Persons Group, where I think they're all in the room, actually. Unfortunately, it would, they say, go ahead, but for the fact that there's no mandate from the Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group. So perhaps, Tricia, you've had some discussions with them, have you? Do we know who the Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group is?
Afraid not. I expect it's
But apparently when we get a hold of them and we talk to them about this, they might actually adopt something, and then we can get this rule of law commissioner. And I think, Peter, you probably need to get involved as well. Anyway, on that brief note, let's take another round of questions. I think we've got time, Sanjay, or not?
One last round.
Oh, one last round. Who wants to be in the last round? Yes, thank you. We've got two over here and one here, so that's three. Does someone want to transmit the mic? Thanks.
Thanks. I hate using these things. Can I be heard clearly?
Yes, we can hear you.
Darren, and I run a little organisation of lawyers called Protobos, and I've been really interested to hear about them. We provide access to law for local communities in developing countries, it's very close to crude. I wanted to ask a question arising out of what's being said about pursuing corporations for bad behaviour. I spent a lot of time working on the corruption trials in Lesotho, where with a willing prosecutor and competent prosecutor, with a willing Attorney General and a competent prosecuting team, a large number of companies were potted fairly and squarely for bribery and then subsequently debarred. My question is this. In that particular jurisdiction, nobody has followed along from that in the slightest. The SFO in this country has ignored advisedly information that was given to them that would have enabled them to mount similar prosecutions in this country. And so when you're looking at putting together a new template for bad corporate behaviour, if the prosecuting teams in the north are so exceptionally reluctant to touch any of their golden balls up here, wouldn't it be a good idea if one actually started looking at strengthening the prosecuting services down in the south? And I have a particular mining company in mind that I will not name because I am being recorded. But it's doing some pretty disgusting and disgraceful things in a small African country, from which surrounding populations are suffering direct adverse consequences. Now, could we not strengthen the process by which litigation could flow in that particular arena? Wouldn't it be a good idea to start doing that and building up the body of this kind of litigation, whether it be civil or criminal, actually in the places where these dire deeds are being done? And then you wouldn't necessarily have to work so hard at knitting up the Spiliada cases, if you like, and the corporate veil, and so on and so forth, which I am dead keen on doing, I should say. But that challenge wouldn't be an extra add-on. You go down there, say, look at what you're doing in court now, and what's more, here's our civil claim. It seems to me that it would strengthen the process and globalise this work effectively. I'd like your views, if I may.
Thanks very much. Yes, thanks.
Sorry.
My name is Andrea Saldarriaga, and I'm a consultant on investment law and social responsibility, corporate social responsibility. And more than a question is a comment, if I may, very rapidly. And is that I think that there is an area of law that has been kind of overlooked in this analysis, and that might have a very important potential in the interaction of business and human rights and the mechanism that we are discussing here this afternoon. And this is the area of the regime for the protection of foreign investment, which is comprised of thousands of bilateral investment treaties and free trade agreements with investment chapters, in which states agree to provide very comprehensive protections for investors. So they include the protection of prohibition of expropriation, the prohibition of discrimination, fair and equitable treatment, good protection and security, and most importantly, investors are given the right to begin arbitration against states in order to enforce these rights. And arbitration that happens sometimes in a big city to the World Bank body for hearing these claims, or even sometimes the ICC, which is a business organization. These treaties, they provide for rights to investors, but they are silent in terms of duties. investors. And there are cases already in which they are brought, of course, by investors, because they are the only ones with the right to bring cases under these treaties. And these cases are bring against the states. And there is a question of the behavior of the investor and sometimes violation of rights, the right of water, for example, in Tanzania or in Argentina, with the exploitation of the concessions, the water concessions. And my comment or my invitation is to reflect a bit of what could be done in this area, because I think that there is a lack of dialogue between the investment and the arbitration community and the human rights community in terms of what could be done and how could these instruments that are very powerful could be used to enforce also human rights.
Thank you. Now, everyone over this side of the room, I think. Yes, please. Thank you.
Después de escuchar lo que pasa en África, que se repite en Asia, se insiste en América Latina como prácticas regulares de estas empresas, no cabría preguntarse que estamos frente a prácticas de las empresas matrices de ceguera intencional o de una negligencia deliberada, y desde ahí para mirar la responsabilidad, porque son las matrices actuando directamente o a través de su subsidiaria.
Well, I think we're about to have an interpretation of that. Yes, thanks. Or a translation, I should say.
So after having listened to what's happening in Africa and Asia and what continues to happen in Latin America, my question is relating to parent companies and the practices which they are carrying out. Is this due to just negligence, or is this due to a lack of knowledge in relation to the regulatory practices which have been already established?
Thank you. Can I please just find out who was asking the question, please?
Jorge Molano.
From?
Colombia.
Organization from Colombia.
Abogado.
Thank you very much. All right, well, I think at this juncture we should probably start answering these questions. Perhaps we could start in reverse order and address the gentleman from Colombia first. Sheldon, would you like to have a go first?
Well, your question, Senor, brings out really three types of company. The ones that know there are risks of abuse and close their eyes. Those that know there are risks of abuse and do something to try and avoid it. And those that are totally ignorant about the situation. I don't have a statistical breakdown or even anecdotal evidence about which would be the majority type of company. What I will say, though, is that the way things are stacked up, the current of wanting to increase parent company responsibility does encounter other obstacles than the one we've mentioned until now, and one of them goes precisely to the area of investment law. I'd like to quickly respond to what you said, but very quickly, the missing element that you described is bank loans. Bank loans are made in colossal amounts by public and private lenders, alongside and sometimes under the aegis of investment treaties. But the bank loans are often, in riskier parts of the world, made to the subsidiary, and sometimes a subsidiary of the subsidiary, precisely because the parent company does not want to be responsible for what happens. So you may think that a deal has been struck between ExxonMobil and the World Bank, the International Finance Corporation, or a private bank. No, it actually was with that small company. Why is that a problem for human rights? Well, if things go belly up, if things go badly wrong, all that has to happen is the parent move out of the country. And Shell, we know, is divesting itself of assets in the Niger Delta, for instance. there may well be no comeback to it because of the corporate veil. I'm sorry, that was only partly a response to your question. Should I quickly say something about the investment treaty? The investment treaty, I think, was very accurate. I agree with what you're saying. It's a very important area to factor into this. And there's an alarm bell ringing. The European Union will now begin to negotiate itself all new investment treaties. And these are very powerful instruments. But it'll happen from Brussels, no longer from each of the constituent countries. Well, it may be this will weaken yet further the kinds of ability to respond to human rights abuses and environmental abuses that you've described, because these treaties are charters of investors' rights, and only by default can you identify investor duties. They're not spelled out very clearly in these instruments. The centralization of these by the European Union could make that even harder to deal with.
Thanks very much, Sheldon, with up-to-date information. Well, that's very impressive indeed. Now, the question about strengthening the prosecutions in southern states was an interesting question. Would someone like to address that? Andie, it sounds like your bailiwick.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I personally think in an ideal world you bring a prosecution as close to where the harm took place as possible. I think part of the reason why we, for example, have started to look at bringing prosecutions in the north is because of all the challenges of bringing them where the harm is taking place, particularly within our organisation. We work in conflict zones or areas which are in, highly unstable situations, and we find often that either, unfortunately, the state itself is complicit in the abuse, in which case, obviously, they're not going to be a good place to bring a case, or they just don't have the infrastructure. I mean, we have worked historically quite a lot in Liberia, and in an ideal world, we'd be bringing prosecutions in Liberia for the actors that facilitated that war. But even the Solicitor General of Liberia, a couple of years ago, who tried to bring a corruption case, failed because of the lack of infrastructure and corruption within the judiciary there. So I think, I think it has to be a sort of, of course we have to strengthen the ability to prosecute in the south, and that is completely a capacity building thing, and there are lots of organisations that are working towards that, but I don't think that means that we stand still while we try and get that possible. I think, I've met with people who are, who are affected communities, who hear about these cases that are happening in places they've never heard of, and from their perspective, they don't know that it's happening. I mean, the case of Gus Koolhoven, the Dutch man that I mentioned in my presentation, he ran a logging company in Liberia, which was one of the major funders of Taylor's civil war efforts. And he was a big man in Liberia. Everyone knew him by name, if not by sight. And I went to Liberia 6 years after the war finished, and people could not believe that he was being held to account anywhere, because he was such a big man, and because it wasn't happening anywhere that they could see it happening. It was happening in the Netherlands, and A, they didn't know where the Netherlands were, and B, they hadn't heard, some of them hadn't even heard the case had happened. So I do think it's really important to have prosecutions as close to where the harm took place. However, at this point, we have numerous challenges in that area as well as the other challenges. And I think partly why we're trying to bring prosecutions against parent company is just to try and get some level of accountability somewhere and get some justice for the victims in sort of one arena. And just to quickly mention on the sort of arbitration stuff, increasingly arbitration is being utilised, and I think it is, and there is an opportunity for human rights workers and defenders to contribute to in arbitration cases. My only fundamental issue with it is that A, they're completely confidential, the judgments are confidential, and it's even difficult to find out when the cases are ongoing, so the ability even to contribute to them is quite challenging. And also, if you do contribute to a case, even sort of at a hands-on level, like with an amicus brief, then while it can be influential, you have to do it again and again and again with each new case. There is no precedent set, or if there is, nobody knows about it, so you can't utilise it. There have been some great amicus briefs filed in a few arbitration cases, but I think for me, my concern about those sort of an increased use of arbitration over a court system is the lack of access and the confidentiality that comes with it. That means that cases get heard and decided essentially in secret, and that for me is an issue. However, I do think that there needs to be more done on the responsibilities of investors, and if we can strengthen or pull out the accountability that way as well, in the way that is happening slowly in the supply chain sort of way, then I think we could have some bigger impact.
Thanks, Andie. And that does raise another issue, which is the role of investors and shareholders generally in campaigns that might come concurrently with cases concerning the companies that they are directly involved with. And increasingly firms, and there are not very many of them who are involved in these cases, are very savvy about using the media and using investment action and contacting shareholders as part of the campaigns to put pressure within the company. And I know of one example, recent example, in a case where we're working with civil society partners, typically NGOs, other kinds of organisations in the South, that some of the people from the civil society went along to the AGMs directly and raised the issue of the subject of the case. Obviously, I'm drawing here upon the apartheid litigation, and in particular, one of the defendants was German, is a German company, and it occurred there. And this is 6 years after litigation commenced. The shareholder group were not unaware of the case, and specific questions were directed to the CEO and the board there in front of the other shareholders, and it has a massive impact on those generally being able to intern. Now they have their own email lists. Quite interesting. They are starting to put pressure on within the companies themselves, and I think there is a whole other conference to be had about how you run these cases with help from other partners in multidisciplinary teams, which is increasingly what these firms are doing, and our firms are doing. Any more questions? I think we've got. Yes, sorry.
I was just going to
we've got some answers.
Reply a bit on. I was thinking of how long it has taken the Texaco case in Ecuador, which concerned oil spills in an indigenous area, natural park, that went to the US initially as an Attica case and then was returned to Ecuador, and it's taken something like 15 years. I mean, it's a fantastic final judgment, but I mean, a hell of a long journey. I'm thinking of so many other cases where they've been returned, like Cambio again, a cyanide spill gold mine, returned by the Canadian court to Guyana because allegedly they could have a proper trial there, closer to events, and it just didn't happen. The company, after giving a promise that it wouldn't use the foreign non-convenience argument back in Guyana, did. And I think one thing we haven't addressed is the procedures. Why are the procedures so weighted to allow clever corporate lawyers who are taking up lots of dosh to play all these sort of tricksy games? And I think very few jurisdictions, when we're talking about civil cases, are the judges armed enough to be strict. Both parties should do their best to present their cases promptly and concisely, but the reverse seems to hold sway, and I think one of the few jurisdictions we know of and we're hopeful about is Quebec, where the procedures have been reformed and this time wasting isn't permitted. And I just think the commitment issue and the laxity of our regulators seems to continue. I was just reading in the Sunday business papers that the head of the UK listing authority for London Stock Exchange has complained that it's not his job to check on the corporate governance aspects of the companies that list, that's up to the individual investors. And, you know, it just seems like, oh God, you know, total abdication of responsibility.
Thanks so much.
Just to reinforce Ingrid's point, campaigning can have a big role in reinforcing host country mechanisms. You only have to look at Vedanta Resources that had very little regulatory opposition to their projects, and suddenly after 2 or 3 years of intense campaigning across the world, suddenly regulatory authorities in India were starting to revoke their licenses, mounting legal challenges. So I think international pressure can play a huge role in creating space in host countries for some of the more progressive forces to assert themselves.
Well, thanks everybody. I've been told we now have run out of time for more questions, and I'm sorry about that. And I'm handing now over to Sanjay.